All right, welcome in everyone. Ready for another deep dive. Today we're wading into some pretty complex waters. We're talking about the Black community and the range of viewpoints you find, specifically focusing on what it means to be Black and conservative versus Black and liberal. And we've got some fascinating source material here, stuff that really gets into the perceptions and, honestly, sometimes the stereotypes that exist on both sides.
Yeah, I mean, it's a conversation that often gets bogged down in assumptions.
Yeah.
You hear Black conservatives labeled as, well, let's just say some pretty charged terms get thrown around, like they're somehow betraying their community. And on the flip side, you've got this image of Black liberals just blindly following whatever the Democratic Party puts out there. So yeah, our goal today is to unpack all of that, really try to understand where these different perspectives are coming from based on what our sources have to say.
Okay, so let's start with something that jumps out right away. Identity and how people see each other. When you hear that sellout label or the term Uncle Tom aimed at Black conservatives, where does that even come from? And is it a fair characterization?
Well, the thing is, those terms carry a lot of historical baggage, right? They're connected to this long history of racial betrayal, of Black individuals siding with the dominant white power structure instead of fighting for Black liberation and progress. So when someone who's Black embraces conservative principles, especially on issues like civil rights or policies meant to address racial inequality, it can trigger those deeply ingrained suspicions. It brings up all those historically charged labels. And that's where it gets interesting because our sources really push us to think about whether that's a fair assessment, a fair label, and what assumptions are feeding into it.
And what about the opposite view, the one that says Black liberals are just puppets for the Democratic Party? What if that alignment actually reflects a genuine agreement with the party's values and the policies it supports, not just like blind obedience or something?
All right, so if you look at the big picture of political affiliations, there's no denying that the vast majority of Black voters consistently support the Democratic Party. And this goes way back, historically, something we'll definitely dig into more. But to automatically jump from that consistent support to saying it's all just blind loyalty, that misses the point that a lot of Black individuals genuinely agree with what the Democratic Party says it stands for, things like civil rights, social justice, economic opportunity. So the challenge the sources give us is to ask ourselves, are we really taking that genuine agreement into account when we critique the political choices of Black liberals?
All right, so let's talk history for a minute. The Republican Party was, the party of Lincoln, the party that ended slavery. What happened? Did they just abandon Black voters after the Civil Rights era? Or did both sides kind of shift their priorities and allegiances?
Yeah, this is a really crucial piece of the puzzle if you want to understand where we are today, politically speaking. I mean, that whole realignment of the major parties in the middle of the 20th century is key here. After the Civil Rights Movement, especially with the rise of what they called the Southern strategy, appealing to white voters in the South who weren't too happy about desegregation, the Republican Party started focusing more and more on that group. And at the same time, the Democratic Party was becoming more vocal about civil rights and social programs. So what our sources seem to suggest is that it wasn't just a simple case of one side ditching the other. It was more complicated than that. Both sides were changing, and Black voters had to figure out where they fit in, where their interests were going to be represented.
And what about the Democrats? If you've got this whole huge block of voters reliably supporting you, is there a risk of taking them for granted? Did the Democratic Party ever fall into that trap, thinking they had the Black vote in the bag no matter what?
That's a great question. And yeah, when you have that level of consistent support, it's easy to get complacent, right? When you know a certain group is always going to vote for you, there might not be as much incentive to go above and beyond for them, to really prioritize their specific needs and concerns compared to those swing voters who could go either way. So the sources make us think about whether that dynamic played out here. Did the Democratic Party sometimes fail to fully prioritize the needs and aspirations of the Black community because they assumed they had their votes locked in?
Okay, let's get into some specific policy areas, welfare programs, for example. One perspective here is that they provide a vital safety net, especially for the Black community, given the historical disadvantages they've faced. But the counter argument is that relying on these programs long term might actually hold people back from becoming self-sufficient. What are the arguments on both sides?
Right, so people who support welfare programs really emphasize their role as a safety net. They help individuals and families get through tough times, especially those hit hardest by economic hardship, which, let's face it, disproportionately affects the Black community due to all those systemic inequalities. The idea is that these programs can create a stepping stone, a foundation that helps people move up by taking care of their basic needs. But then you have the critics, And their concern is that if you depend on welfare for too long, it can discourage people from working. It creates this cycle of dependency that ultimately prevents long-term economic progress and self-reliance. So you've got this fundamental disagreement highlighted in the sources about the real role and the overall impact of these programs, specifically within the Black community.
Another hot button issue is school choice. Does giving Black families more options, like charter schools or vouchers, lead to better education for their kids? Or does it end up weakening the public school system that the majority of Black students rely on?
Yeah, the whole school choice debate, especially as it relates to Black families, it's super complicated and there's a lot of back and forth. Those who are for it argue that it gives kids in underserved areas a chance to go to better schools, schools that might have more resources, better teachers, and that could lead to them getting a better education and doing better academically. They also see it as giving parents more control, letting them choose what's best for their children, especially if the local public schools aren't cutting it. But then you've got the other side, and they're worried that these programs will end up taking money away from public schools that are already struggling, schools that are underfunded as it is. And that hurts the majority of Black students who are still in those traditional public schools. And then there's another layer to all of this, the question of whether everyone has equal access to these choice programs in the first place. So yeah, this is presented in the sources as a major policy issue, one with huge implications for the Black community.
And sticking with economics for a minute, what about the role of capitalism itself within the Black community? Is it seen as a path to prosperity, something that encourages Black entrepreneurship and wealth creation? Or is it viewed as a system that's inherently rigged against Black people and just perpetuates inequality?
This is another one where you see a huge difference in perspective. Black conservatives often see capitalism and free markets as the best way to create economic growth and opportunity. They believe that those systems can empower Black people to build businesses, create jobs, achieve financial independence. Right. But then Black liberals, and they often point to the whole history of racial capitalism, how capitalism and racial hierarchies have always been intertwined. They tend to argue that if you let capitalism run wild, it's going to make existing inequalities even worse. They say you need systemic interventions to make sure that wealth and resources are distributed more fairly. So yeah, the sources present this as a fundamental ideological dividing line.
All right, let's shift gears to social issues. First up, defund the police, a phrase that really gets people fired up. Within the Black community, is this seen as a solution to police brutality and systemic racism? Or is there a fear that it could backfire and lead to more crime and less safety in Black neighborhoods?
Oh, yeah, the defund the police movement, that's definitely sparked a lot of debate within the Black community. I mean, there are a lot of different experiences and perspectives on law enforcement there. Some people see it as a total reimagining of public safety. It's about moving away from just relying on armed police and instead focusing on community-based solutions, addressing the root causes of crime like poverty and lack of opportunity. They see it as a step towards reducing police violence, which we all know disproportionately targets Black individuals. But then you have others who are really worried that defunding the police will just lead to more crime and make their communities less safe. They might be more in favor of reforming the police, working within the existing system, rather than completely dismantling it. And the sources highlight this as a very sensitive and very divisive issue.
Another issue that's been debated for a long time: affirmative action. Are those policies still necessary to counteract the effects of historical and ongoing discrimination? Or are they now creating problems of their own, maybe fostering a sense of dependency or resentment between different groups?
Affirmative action has a long and complicated history, and there's a lot of disagreement about whether it's still needed today. Yeah. People who support it say it's absolutely essential to level the playing field. It makes sure that Black people and other groups who had been historically marginalized have a fair shot at getting into good schools and getting good jobs, considering all the discrimination they've faced and continue to face. But then you have the critics, and they argue that these policies can lead to reverse discrimination, they say, that it puts too much emphasis on what group you belong to instead of looking at individual merit. And they're worried that it might create a sense of dependency or even stigma. So this is another key area where the sources show Black conservatives and Black liberals having fundamentally different views on how to achieve equality and opportunity.
This kind of brings us to a really fundamental tension, the idea of racial solidarity versus individual beliefs. Should Black Americans present a united front politically, based on their shared racial identity? Or is it more important to stick to your own personal beliefs, even if they go against the majority opinion in your community? It makes you think, about the pressure people might feel to conform to a certain political view just because of their race.
That's a huge question that gets to the heart of identity and having a voice in politics. The whole idea of racial solidarity has very deep roots, coming from that shared history of fighting against racism and oppression. It's the idea that Black people need to act together, speak with one voice, to effectively fight for their interests. But at the same time, our sources acknowledge that there's a growing diversity of thought within the Black community.
Hmm.
And when people prioritize their own beliefs, that can lead them to different political parties, different ways of approaching the challenges facing the community. So there's no easy answer here. People are constantly trying to figure out how to navigate those sometimes competing priorities.
Okay, let's talk about political representation for a minute. The source material asks us to think about why there are so few Black conservatives in elected office. What might be some of the reasons for that?
Well, there are probably several factors at play here. One big one is probably the historical connection between the Black community and the Democratic Party, which obviously influences how people vote and how political organizing happens within the community. Another thing that might be contributing is those perceptions and stereotypes we were talking about earlier, that sellout label, for example. That might make it harder for Black conservatives to get widespread support within their own community. And then you also have to consider access to things like political networks, campaign funding, all that party infrastructure. It's not a simple situation. It's a mix of historical, social, and political forces all coming together.
What about Black liberals who are in Congress? Are they mainly focused on representing the specific interests of the Black community, or are they more aligned with the broader goals and agenda of the Democratic Party?
That's a really important question about accountability and representation. And it's not just specific to Black politicians or the Black community. It applies to any elected official who represents a diverse group of people. The sources make us think about whether that strong historical link between Black voters and the Democratic Party creates an expectation that Black Democratic representatives should be putting the needs of the Black community first and foremost. But then again, these politicians also have to work within the structures of their party. They have to consider the needs of all their constituents, not just one group. So it's a balancing act, and how they approach it will vary from person to person.
Media plays a huge role in shaping how we see the world. Do you think the mainstream media might present a biased view of Black conservatives? Maybe by focusing on the most controversial figures or stories that emphasize division?
It's definitely worth asking whether there might be some bias, intentional or not, in how mainstream media portrays Black conservatives. The media loves conflict. They love highlighting differences. So it's possible that Black conservative viewpoints are mainly framed in opposition to the more dominant liberal views within the Black community. And that might create a picture that doesn't really capture the full range of thinking within that group. The sources encourage us to be critical of what we see and hear in the media, to ask ourselves if the representations we're getting are really accurate and if they truly reflect the complexity of thought within the Black community.
And flipping that around, do you think Black liberals face pressure to stick to a strict progressive line? A pressure from their own community or from progressive media outlets, even if they might not fully agree with every single progressive idea?
Yeah, that kind of pressure definitely exists in any political movement or community. There's this tendency to prioritize unity and staying true to core beliefs. And that can sometimes lead to pressure to conform to certain orthodoxies, to toe the line, especially within the progressive space. So if someone voices a dissenting opinion or presents a more nuanced view on certain issues, they might get criticized or be seen as not being a true believer. And the source material points to this as an important dynamic within Black liberal politics.
So looking ahead, what do you think the future of Black politics might look like? Will this ideological diversity continue to grow? Or is there a chance that the gap between Black conservatives and Black liberals will actually widen?
It's hard to say for sure, but there are definitely some trends that suggest that diversity of thought within the Black community will keep evolving and maybe even become more pronounced. You have generational differences, more economic diversity, greater access to information and different perspectives through all these different media sources. All of that can contribute to a wider range of political beliefs. So the question is, will that lead to an even bigger divide? Or will it create new opportunities for people to come together around shared goals, even if they disagree on some things? The sources leave that as an open question.
And despite all these different viewpoints, all these disagreements about policy, do you think there's any common ground where Black conservatives and Black liberals can work together on things they both care about?
Even though we've been talking about some pretty significant ideological differences, the sources do offer some hope. They suggest that there are probably some fundamental goals and values that most people in the Black community share. Things like wanting to see progress, wanting more opportunities, and wanting overall well-being for the community. So the key is to find those areas of agreement, even if people disagree on how to get there. That could be a really powerful way to start a productive dialogue and maybe even find solutions to the problems facing the community.
Last but not least, what about the next generation of Black voters? Based on what's happening in the world right now, the issues they're inheriting, do you think they'll be more drawn to conservative ideas or progressive ideas?
Well, how the next generation votes will depend on a lot of things.
Yeah.
Their own personal experiences, the social and economic conditions they grow up in, and the political messages that really resonate with them. Issues like climate change, racial justice, economic inequality, and access to technology, those are going to be huge for them. So it's a fascinating question. Will those issues push them more towards conservative solutions or progressive solutions? Or will they maybe come up with entirely new ideological frameworks and approaches? We'll just have to wait and see.
Well, this has been a really insightful look at a topic that I think is often misunderstood. It's pretty clear from all these different perspectives that those labels we hear so often, sellout, puppet, they're just way too simplistic. They don't even come close to capturing the nuances of individual beliefs, motivations, and experiences within the Black community.
Absolutely. The sources really drive home the point
Mhm.
that we need to move past those reductive stereotypes and start having more thoughtful, more nuanced, and definitely more respectful conversations about the different paths people within the Black community believe in, the paths they believe will lead to real progress, empowerment, and a more just society for everyone.
So for you, the listener, the big takeaway here is this. The political landscape in any community is never black and white, right? It's more like a tapestry, with all these different viewpoints interwoven, each one shaped by history, personal experiences, and deeply held beliefs. And if we want to have a more informed, more productive, and ultimately more unified conversation, we need to understand those different perspectives, even when they challenge our own.
And on that note, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with something to think about. Considering everything we've talked about today, all the different viewpoints we've explored, what are some fundamental values that might bridge the gap between Black conservatives and Black liberals? Even if they disagree strongly on certain policies, what are those underlying aspirations they might share for the Black community, even if their strategies for getting there are completely different? That's something I think is worth reflecting on, even after our conversation ends.